Hello, everyone. Welcome back to IDRiM podcast. And today's we delve into another publications. But the good news is it's the publication of one of our co-hosts, it's, Mark Ashley Parry, and our presenter here published a new book chapter with the titles of The Cognizance of Climate Change within the United Kingdom as a part of the Gedry book series. First of all, congratulations, Marks. How are you feeling about this?
Yeah, I'm great. It's took a few years to write this one. I first started working on this in 2015 as a concept, and then doing the research over the years, and then finally submitted it last year, and it's literally just 2 weeks ago finally been released. So it's great.
Finally, after years of hard work and sweat and tears.
Absolutely.
All right then. Looking at the titles, my first question to you is, what exactly do we mean when we say climate change? How is it different from many other terms like the used to be a famous one like global warming or climate crisis or climate emergency?
Yeah, so this is something that I try to teach a lot of my students. So one of the things I do, I go around to educational facility institutes, like schools and colleges, and very much try to teach. When I teach this, is the very first question, the very first point I like to make. There is a difference between climate change and global warming. So climate change and global warming are very similar terms, but global warming really just refers to the warming of the world's atmosphere. So that year on year on year, we've seen a trend towards a warmer. So we're now at 1.1, 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial time. But that's only a bit of a story, and that's where climate change encapsulates everything else. It's about the change not just in the temperature, but the change in precipitation, humidity, wind. It's about changing basically every element of the climate system, but also that then obviously links down to changes in the way that animals live, plants live and interact, and all that. And so that them two terms often get confused in the public mind, and we'll probably come to talk about that as well. And there are people who will be very skeptical, and they use this argument saying, well, you used to call it global warming, now you call it climate change. The global warming bit was good when we first talked about it, because it was very much about, when we're trying to encapsulate that the planet is getting too hot and it's getting warmer and warmer. Yeah, that warming bit, people can envision that. But because it was only telling part of the story, it wasn't the best term to use. Now, more recently, we've heard, climate crisis, climate emergency, and they are slightly different terms, and depending upon who you ask will depend upon what do they mean. So, before the recording, we were talking about climate emergency versus climate crisis. And here in the UK in particular, emergency is the one that gets used a lot more. One of the reasons is around 2019, many of our dissolved parliaments and also local governments, we declaring climate emergencies, that there's an emergency that we need to tackle climate change, where climate crisis is to refer that the climate is in a crisis and it's a crisis moment for humanity. So each one has very subtle differences. The term that we should really be using is obviously climate change. Once I was doing some reading for this recording, I noticed climate crisis and climate emergency is used more in the academic literature. Would I use climate crisis or climate emergency as a term to describe it? Probably not, because I feel that then we are slipping into, and yes, it is a crisis, I'm not going to deny it, but my concern is that then we start to slip into a scaremongering type of approach, which I don't want to do, or be accused of being exaggerating. We need to keep it simple. We need to keep it very straight and not change the lexicon too many times, because at the minute I feel that we are changing it quite a few times, and it then confuses in the mind of the public what we mean.
Well, as you mentioned, that it's the focus of it's the due to the changes in the all climate systems. Well, I'm curious now that is are the climate is ever changing or it just supposed to be stable? If
Hmm.
you know, I mean, like the Earth is more than 4.5 billion years, if I recall correctly. So it means like during the long period or short periods in the very different perspective. Like I think, well, there must be some changing the climate throughout the million years. Why should we concern with current climate change? What is the difference between the previous one if there is a change before?
Right. Yes. So the climate has obviously changed quite, multiple times, and a lot of them are, you know, quite shallow changes, and a lot of them are quite sudden changes, and we've seen really sudden ones. But these usually have external factors, that do this. So either, we've had, asteroid strikes, that causes like almost like a nuclear winter style blackout of the sun. That's going to be a sudden, within a few year change. Same with volcanic activity. You can see that major volcanic activity can either, in some cases, can warm up, but in most cases, cool down the planet. And we've seen that even in human history that major eruptions do make changes, but we're not talking about the big, VEI 7 type of eruptions. We're talking only fives and sixes, and they'd still make major ones. So the three that I always think of is 1991 Mount Pinatubo, dropped the world's temperature by 0.3 of a degree for 2 years. That's relatively small, and really wasn't majorly noticed that much, in the grand scheme of the climate, because we'd already warmed up, so it just brought it down to a bit more of a normal weather. The other was Krakatoa in the 1800s. We all remember, Krakatoa and, its impacts, global impacts around 1815, 1816. And then the other one, which for the non-European audience will probably not know as much about, and it goes back a lot further, is Laki back in the 1600s. So Laki, which was a different type of volcanic activity event, it was not one of the more explosive ones. It was a 17-mile fission eruption, which produced a large quantity of sulfur dioxide. That interaction with our climate made, some huge changes, and we've seen even frost events in the United States, in particular New York State, in July. So, these, even a little, one like that can still happen today. The other thing is that it's not like, one of the things we also have to remember is that it's not like so this one is, different because it's human activity. So it's us chopping down forests, it's us burning, fossil fuels. That is building the carbon in the atmosphere, and we can track it from past records that when there's more carbon in the atmosphere, the temperatures go up. The other thing is that it's not the first time the humans have spotted that they can alter the climate. So in that paper, I talk about, ancient Greeks observed human influences on the climate. That's important to also remember. So in that book chapter, I highlighted the cases of where they observed this, and in this is it basically the theory came out was is that they were trying to find land to grow agriculture, and there were a couple of cases. So one of them was where they drained the marshes because marshland's not, you can't really grow very much in a marsh. And what they found was is that the land was more susceptible to freezing. They also noticed as well that when they cleared the forests, that the temperature of that region warmed up. because and also it dried out as well, because what happened was is that trees hold moisture. They have this, they have the ability to hold moisture. They have a cooling effect, and removing these trees basically resulted in microclimate changes. So the concept of climate change, doesn't matter if it's global or local, has been around for over 2,000 years. It's not a new concept. It's just that the concept that we're talking about today is a relatively new concept, and it's only been really around for about 60, 70 years as an idea, but it's got a lot of science involved in it.
Well, I mean, like if you mention it like that, so it's actually the human history has observed several climate change, regardless of the scales. Even as you mentioned in your chapters about basically any other human activities that we basically improving themselves, from the hunter-gatherer to be agriculture, change the climates, and then as moving from that to industrial age also change the climate, and now we are coming to the modern age. I guess all those processes keep piling up and change our climate so much. And before I'm moving on to the next questions, so how is climate change currently affecting the UK? And in what ways people might already have noticed in their daily lives about this climate change currently?
So in the UK, it's very much well, first of all, it's warmer. I don't think I can get away from that. I mean, we're recording this today, at the end of August. It's 28 degrees. That's pretty warm for where I live in the UK. And the UK is literally already had 4 heat waves in 1 year, which is exceptional. There has been many years where we don't have any heat waves in the UK. So we are very much warming up. 2022 was the warmest, had the warmest ever temperature, over 40 degrees Celsius. So we're very much, that trend has gone up. What we're also noticing, and we obviously can't fully ascribe whether it is climate change yet, but it goes with what the models were suggesting, is that this summer here in the UK has been one of the driest. So I'm hearing, not far from where I live, reservoirs are only 40% full, and if we don't get rain soon, we could be in quite a bit of trouble on this. Also, the UK has had a lot of wildfires this year, more than I've ever known, including one that took over a week. To put out literally about 30 miles to the south of where I live, and you can actually taste it when the wind was blowing from the south, and that weirdly enough also raises questions about infrastructure, because the fire was right next to our nuclear monitoring base as well. So that is a joint venture between the US and the UK, and there were rumors that there were explosions because the fires were blowing up the old landmines. So we got all these concerns, in that sense. Warmer winters. So historically, winters killed more than summers do, especially with the elderly, because because obviously frostbite, cold conditions, harder to keep people warm. So that has been a bit, we've had less deaths in winter, which is great. But the concern now is obviously, now as we're moving to warmer summers, is that death rate just moving. And what's interesting is it is putting pressure on the services. So what it is doing is our National Health Service, July, August, it's usually the quietest 2 months of the year, because usually what you're doing is the cold, is where you get a lot of, cold in. The cold keeps people in, that causes respiratory diseases as well, and all that. But what's starting to happen is that we're now getting people coming in from heat stress, heat stroke, and we're now having the other end of the spectrum in the summer months. So basically, we're getting to a point where the NHS is just permanently, our National Health Service is just permanently, overrun by weather related. Also, flooding is the last one of the impact. That type of impact. Flooding has become a major issue for the UK. I say that as, like I said, we're in the middle of a drought here in the UK, but flooding, in particular in the winter months, has been a major problem. And increasingly, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, we keep building on floodplains because we need more land. So we've got this battle almost now between the environment, climate, and human influences, and it's all becoming a bit of a mess of a melting pot. So the UK is, getting hit from all sides. The one factor that I don't think in the UK we've quite comprehended just yet, we're starting to comprehend the water issue, and the blame, partly rightly, is going on the water companies because they have been wasting. They're quite wasteful, and they have been increasing prices, to upgrade the infrastructure, and it hasn't actually fully happened. But the other thing that I don't, but the thing is that we're naturally already going to have a dry summer. But the thing that I don't think that they have fully comprehended is what that dry summer is probably going to lead to in the UK going into the winter months, and that is going to be food and food availability. And that is the thing that I think that we don't fully comprehend yet. So farmers in the UK are already given warnings. We're already harvesting weeks and weeks ahead of schedule because there's no point of leaving them in almost sand soil because they're not going to grow anything. So they're just trying to recover, and the farmers have warned that we're probably going to have a shortage. So we're going to have to buy food in. Where we're going to buy it from? Well, in the UK, typically we get a lot of our food from Spain, which has had lots of wildfires this year. So then it comes to the question: will Spain want to send food that they need to us? The other one is Morocco, is our other major ally when it comes to trade partner for food in winter. I don't know what the situation is down in Morocco. That has been in recent months. So the UK is probably doesn't quite fully recognize yet, but it is extremely vulnerable. And given that the UK is in a cost of living crisis, what one could probably say is that the price is probably going to go up this winter, and it's going to drive another wave of anger and frustration. The cost of living is just going to keep going up. So I think that even the cost of living crisis that we're seeing right now mostly is being influenced by other external factors like war, in particular in the Middle East, and with Israel, and also in Ukraine. I think that the climate crisis is going to be another factor that's going to push food prices up this winter and probably going in future winters as well.
Well, all the things that you mentioned, actually, I guess from my perspective, it should be have been realized by UK people because, like as you mentioned, more people admitted to the hospitals to the heat stroke and heat wave, and the long wildfires that actually threaten one of the important critical infrastructures and even affect the people living surrounding that area. But your chapter actually point out that many people still think climate change is something happening somewhere else. So I think there is some gap here with what you mentioned. Do the people don't really feel it in their lives that it's okay? We live in different age now. I mean, why they do still think about that it's happening somewhere else instead of their lives?
I think it comes down to, let me be careful what I say here. I think it's a bit of it is down to the slow creeping onset of climate change. Climate change is not an event that happens overnight. It's a thing that happens bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And sometimes if you're looking at, it's a bit like growing hair. You don't notice it's getting long until it's really quite long. But if it grew overnight, you'd notice it. it's also like the boiling frog thing. The old saying, which is not fully true, but it's insane, is if you put a frog in hot water, it'll jump straight back out. If you put it in cool water and then slowly turn the heat up and warm it up, it won't notice until a lot later on. It's that analogy, and I think that's one of the issues. I think people are not, because it's not massively rapid. I can see it different. I can observe it already in my lifetime that it is different. Um, Mostly I observed, the summers are warmer, the winters are less snow. They're the two main observations I can observe in my lifetime. I'm 32, and in 25 years, I can see that difference. But I think the the main reason why we see it as a faraway issue is that the way that it's been portrayed as a faraway issue, the way that it's taught in schools and colleges, it's a faraway issue. The way the media portray it in terms of, saying there's a flooding, like this week we're recording, there's flooding in Pakistan, there is wildfires in Spain and Greece. So we're seeing it as a faraway issue. What a lot of people don't know is that in the last, week and a half, 2 weeks, how many wildfires have happened in the UK? We've got one of the biggest wildfires the UK has seen, literally, as I said, to the south of me. Right now, literally, there's another wildfire 3 miles away from where I live. I mean, so that you can see it, and yes, that one happens a lot more frequently because it's arson. But why is it taking hold? It's taking hold because it's very dry. So we can see that there are, that these events are all happening all over the place, but the media's attention isn't captured as much. It will do if there's a major flood. And what happens is, in these really extreme events, the attention jumps. People attention jumps to these events, and concern suddenly rapidly increases. But then it just goes away again. And that's the bigger issue here. It goes away and people, go back to their everyday life because they are very much trained upon the crisis. So that's why climate crisis is a good term, but I wouldn't personally would describe it publicly as a crisis. I think also is that there are other factors as well. And I think that it's a little bit of the issue as well is to do with, and this is the concern about lexicon I was having about, as debating about a few minutes ago. Global warming as a term, we use first, then we move to climate change. But at the same time as global warming, there was a second term, global cooling. And that term came out around the same time. So this comes out around the debate when climate science was in its very infancy. We were trying to just understand, was the planet warming? Was it cooling? And this comes down to regional variations, basically. So we observed that there were some cold spells in the 70s in the United States, and particularly in the winter months. So you're going to have this, debate over, are we warming? Are we cooling? What is going on? And what that meant is that the scientists were researching, are we warming? Are we cooling? The media, obviously. So what happens is that as the very first discussions were happening about, for changing the climate, we use both terms. The planet's getting warmer, the planet's getting colder. And actually, that is very much, we can see. So in my report, I actually list, and this is when I said about the US, the 4 that I could find were major news articles, were all from the United States. And I'll just read a couple of them out. So this is from the Washington Post in 11th of January 1970. Cold winters herald a new dawn of the new ice age. Scientists see ice age in the future. November 72, science, another ice age. So what you see there is that, just them two alone, and these are very, Washington Post, Time Magazine, these are huge, publications in America, but obviously it would travel across, into UK as well. So I think that's what happened. And in what I see in, when I was doing some of my research, so I went out and actually was asking people, why do you use certain terms? What do they think of climate? And one of the an elderly gentleman from the southeast of England said that he was old enough to remember when we were told that we would all have to move to the Sahara Desert because of a new ice age. And I think some of that sticks in the mind. And I think that's why people see it as, maybe it's a faraway issue, but also why they don't even believe it's an issue. Because it's something that is very much that they're being told of something different. Now, I think what is also confusing the point as well is that certain media in the United Kingdom, and I will name them, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express in particular, are, so these are right-wing tabloids, not very accurate, very inaccurate newspapers, and they will typically use sensationalistic language. And they have a habit of producing reputable conversations on if climate change is even real. So, just to give you a sense, literally, let's say 2010, the Daily Mail, the mini ice age starts here. Daily Express, the dawn of a new ice age. So that same terms back in the 1970s is getting used again. And it doesn't just happen in 2010. We've seen them in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 2020, the latest one. For example, latest one was actually from the Daily Star. Mini ice age on Earth could cause -50 temperatures and food shortages, experts warn. What experts? It actually comes from a scientist whose study was actually retracted because it was inaccurate. But they didn't retract the article. So this type of scaremongering is making people wonder, is this even real? And I think that all this is getting muddled up saying, is this a faraway issue? Yes, because the media is portraying it as a faraway issue, not as a local. But also mixed in all this is that there's a sizable group who think it's either natural or it's not happening at all. And that really then confuses and muddies the picture.
Well, a lot of discussion on the media. It's like there's many interesting things I want to ask for examples. Can you enlighten me about the motivations of such media doing shaping the view of the climate change of the peoples? I mean, like, are they targeting a specific group of people and just hope that it will just blow up and change the perception of the whole populations? And is this, I mean, like you mentioned many different UK magazines and tabloids and medias particularly, and how this affect people in UK? I mean, like, is there any differences with the people in the US or any part of the Europes, for examples? Is there any differences that makes that, oh, someone who supported global warming, I understand and realize, and then eventually climate change, and then someone, okay, it's cooling actually, and like there is no such climate change? What do you think about this?
So I think basically what you'll see is that those news media that I've just talked about is there are basically two categories within them. So they're basically within a two category part. One, the tabloid. So tabloid based upon sensationalistic, celebrity gossip type, so they're not straight away, they're not the most credible. And what they basically sell papers based upon sensationalistic headlines, and some of them are very, I have seen ones which are borderline acceptable, even in normal talk. The other thing is a lot of these ones are right wing, and in the US we talk about left wing versus right wing, on the perception of climate change, and increasingly in the UK it is becoming left versus right in terms of climate change, especially with so this goes on after this paper ends. This goes on now. What we're seeing is the most right wing party, mainstream party, is called Reform UK, and Reform UK are anti-climate change science, I would say, pretty much. They are very much introduced. They just announced literally today they want to introduce fracking straight away if they could win the next election. So they're very much pro-fossil fuel, kind of anti-science because they know that the science will not back up what they want to do. So they spread, so there is this wave that it comes back to the tobacco playbook of the 1950s. So the tobacco playbook, which is very much about merchants of doubt, is that the way to delay legislation, laws, changes that are needed to fix the problem is you confuse the science behind it. You look for any vulnerabilities, weakness, and you attack it. And once you confuse the science in the minds of the public, you lose public support. Therefore, it falls down the list, and then you delay it. So, I mean, we knew about secondhand tobacco, the dangers of secondhand tobacco in the 1950s. When did we get the legislation? 2005 in the European Union and UK.
Yeah.
A delay of over 60 years. More people smoke today than did in the 1950s. The problem is not going away. Smoking is not going away. And they use, and we know that oil companies use the same tricks as the tobacco companies did. So we know that the oil companies knew in the late 50s, early 60s about this problem. It's 2025 and we haven't hit peak carbon yet. So when we talk about media, they're going to cater for their audience. They're also going to cater for their sponsors as well because they're private entities and they want to make a profit. So therefore, they'll probably, and I'm not going to say they are because I don't know fully, but they're probably getting money from certain companies to, not, to publish stories against them, or nudge them towards them stories. I think whilst left, lean ones are very much pushing the science narrative. Now, how does that affect the UK? Well, in the UK, our media is predominantly dominated by right-leaning, centre to right-leaning newspapers historically. Therefore, that means that there's a lot of misinformation does get pumped out. So if we think about it, when we talk circulation of newspapers historically, the Sun is number one, was always number one. The Sun is owned by News Corp. So that's the same ones who own Fox News in America. So you can pretty much get a sense of that they are not very pro climate change science. So, there, and then when you look at online newspapers, of today, which one's is the dominant one? It's the Daily Mail, another right wing kind of anti-science stance they kind of adopt. So you got this concern, again, and not exactly given the best picture of what the science represents. One of the good things is, historically in the UK is that when we talk about media, there's obviously different types of media, and the other is television media. In the UK, we have Ofcom, which is meant to stop, the publishing of these types of more extremist, non-scientific views. And for a long time, it worked. We never had any extreme left or extreme right media. It was always more towards the center. So that always was like a fire guard against that. What we have seen since 2020, 2021 is the rise of a media company called GB News, which is basically Fox News in the UK. And there is a lot of anti-climate science on there. And they almost feel like they're not being punished for saying that. It's it's the smallest of the ones, but it's grown quite quickly, and it grows at the same time as where Reform. And by the way, a number of their journalists are Reform UK politicians. So there's a debate over that as well. But this is where you get this issue. And I feel that it is starting to affect the confidence and the public. The data shows that it's been relatively steady in people perceiving climate change. My concern is that when you look at some of the more recent data, is that if you look at number of people who don't believe that climate change is real in the Reform UK party, they are by far higher than any other party. And that's a relatively new part. And my concern is that it's going to keep growing as their politicians push this anti-climate stance.
Now, as you mentioned, that the number of people is growing to be either side is kind of steady, but can you give me more explanation on distributions relative to their age? Perhaps is there any tendency based on age that people will lean towards pro climate? I mean, like understanding climate change or reject the climate change notions, or also perhaps the regional differences throughout the UK also play a part on it or not? I mean, like it's just like people like if you mentioned just okay, people are steadily uh saying that this and like usually this kind of people, but would like to know how it's actually distributed across different typology.
Yes, so in the UK there is this historical concept that as you get older, you become more conservative. You move from left to right. Now, the theory behind that is that as you accumulate more wealth, you don't want that distribution of your wealth. So that's why that typically happens. What and that and typically Reform UK voters are those, and I don't want to generalize this, and categorize someone who's a Reform UK voter. But typically, most Reform UK voters are non-educated, university educated voters. They out of all the five main parties, they are the ones with the highest non-university entrance population. They are slightly older. Having said that, Reform UK is now generating a lot of younger. So typically, what you find is that as you get older, there is this also growing skepticism of climate change. What I'm concerned about, and I know that I've raised a similar concern on a previous podcast, is social media, particularly TikTok. So Reform UK are very good at social media. It's one of the things that they are good at, and they have a style that captures the public's attention. Who uses social media the most? It's the youngest generation. So my concern, and they're actually growing in the youngest generation. So they are behind Green and Labour. So now they're the largest right wing. So my concern is that if I, is that how many of those 90, it's like 19% or some whatever it is, percent, how many of those believe in that anti-science message or are going to become believing in that message? So my concern is that basically there's an old saying when in climate, the skeptic only has to be right once. We have to be right all the time. Because once one prediction goes wrong, you're bringing doubt into the science process. Once you bring doubt into the science process, you then have then you've got these politicians or people who are against the science can attack it, and people will listen because they've made that one prediction where the scientists got it wrong. Now, that's one of the reasons why the IPCC used to be historically a lot more timid in its responses and why you wouldn't have this massive exaggeration of language. But as it's becoming an increasing crisis, the language is getting stronger. But that's a double-edged sword. Yes, it's getting stronger, so it's making more awareness, and we can see that the spike, of awareness of concern of climate change is around the time of Greta Thunberg. When this more, stronger language from the scientific community was really first coming out. But what's the other side of that, sword? The other side of that sword is more that we push hard, the more people think, well, you're starting to sound like them. So how, if you're using that language, are you trying to say, but it's really a crisis, or are you trying to make it look like a crisis? So we got to be very careful on the exact wording we use, because even just little changes in words can change everything. Could literally change an opinion